The decisions as to how to handle the pandemic.
Good afternoon. My name's Helen Collis. I'm a healthcare journalist at Politico, and you're watching Politico Live, the live extension of our journalism. I'm coming to you from our office in Brussels, where today we're discussing mental health care. Since 2019, citizens have faced a series of unprecedented shocks that have been felt far and wide. From the overwhelming ordeal of the pandemic to the devastating war in Ukraine, the subsequent energy crisis and surging inflation, and now to the Israel-Hamas war. It's little wonder that rates of mental health care disorders are rising. In Ukraine alone, up to 4 million people are currently suffering with post-traumatic stress disorder. Meanwhile, many young people faced with arguably the biggest challenge of a generation, trying to fix the climate change crisis, feel helpless as floods and extreme heat become frequent events. No one is immune from these struggles facing them today, young and old. Suicide, for example, is the leading cause of death among young men in the UK. But there is hope. In the last year, Europe has seen several initiatives designed to help prevent and treat mental health care disorders. The European Commission published its first mental health plan in June, and this document calls on EU countries to provide access to adequate and effective prevention, high quality and affordable mental health care and treatment, and for patients to be able to reintegrate into society after recovery. The European Council has delivered 4 documents that pledge to improve mental health care by tackling precarious employment, the impacts of mental health on young people, caring for people who have substance abuse problems, and last week, tackling the determinants of mental health care while implementing mental health care across all policies. And it's a theme that goes beyond Europe. The United States this year launched a 3-year mental health strategy that aims to place mental health promotion, prevention, and treatment at the core. Today, with our panellists, we'll be looking in more detail at the scale of this mental health crisis and ask whether the measures recently announced will be enough to turn the tide on this growing issue. But first, a few housekeeping remarks. I would like to thank our partner, Boehringer Ingelheim, for making this event possible, and our fantastic Politico Live team. We want to make this event as interactive as possible, so if you hear something you'd like to share on social media, please use the hashtag #GlobalMindMatters. You can also ask questions through the Slido. Please provide your name if you do, and you can also share your thoughts and answers to the poll presented by our partner, Boehringer Ingelheim. That question is, how aware of your country's political strategy or goals to improve mental health care are you? We'll look at the results at the end of our session. We will now hear some opening remarks from our partner, Dr. Nadim Pipic, Head of Mental Health at Boehringer Ingelheim, who is joining us remotely. Nadim.
Hi, Helen. Thank you. Just want to welcome also our esteemed panelists and thank Politico and you, Helen, for moderating a very important discussion today. And just to be brief, but also repeat a few of the key points you have touched. When we think about the burden of mental health, it is profound, and the impact of mental health disorders is touching the lives of 1 in 8 individuals globally. And it also is one of the key reasons why we are having one of what I hope many more discussions like today to address a challenge which you see both in the EU, 84 million people or 1 in 6 were affected by mental health issues, nearly 50 million adults in the US. And these figures have only been exacerbated during the pandemic. It led to additional strains on mental health. And as you mentioned, Helen, also particularly among the youth who are really grappling with the challenges in daily lives. And we talked a lot about the human factor, but also the toll on the economic side is one which is extremely or disproportionate to the size of it. If you think about it, the economic impact of mental health disorders and the whole strain on the system is an estimated annual cost of around 4% of the European Union's GDP. And obviously something which you could similarly compare to the US. And I'm seeing Ken here being on behalf of NAMI. I'm sure we'll have a few more examples also from the US to add there. We talked about the burden. Maybe one other very important thing which also causes that strain on the system is the treatment gap. Many people still struggle to access mental health services. In the EU, of course, given the 27 member states, the access to services varies widely with either major issues to psychiatrists, major issues to get access there, or just not having the right level of insurance to have those services covered. And very similar and pronounced in the US, where almost a quarter of all adults with mental health illness basically are not able to receive the treatment they need. Mainly due to either not having an insurance, limited coverage of services. So there is a clear disconnect between the primary care systems and the mental health services. And the further point, which you've mentioned very prominently, is the importance of the policy to really make this a policy initiative which is cross-sectoral, which is cross-disciplinary, and focuses on implementation through pathways to really address these gaps which go across many, many areas. The 2022 National Mental Health Strategy should help strengthen the system capacity, and the same is true for the new EU comprehensive approach to mental health, released just last June, as you also briefly mentioned. And last but not least, we from Boehringer Ingelheim's side, we truly believe that we can play a unique role in driving research, development, but also the accessibility to treatments that can truly make a difference in the lives of those affected. And I think to this end, also within our research, we also want to have a more targeted approach. We call it precision psychiatry, in terms of just focusing truly on the most impactful symptoms that are connected to the brain biology, to have more predictable, to have more effective and more tolerable treatments. And what I'm very much looking forward to today is that, looking at the diversity of our panelists, they truly reflect this power of the collaboration need and the synergies that we need between industry, government, civil society, which is crucial in developing policies that are not only effective, but also reflective of the different needs of our population and all those with mental health challenges. So I think we have the capacity to really make an impact, but it really takes more than a village, and it takes all areas to collaborate to make a difference. And with that, Helen, I hand over to you and very much look forward to a lively discussion.
Thank you very much, Nadim, for your comments there. Very insightful. And now, as you said, we are going to be joined by our panelists for a discussion. We have with us, joining us remotely, we have MEP Sarah Sedas of the Socialists and Democrats group from Portugal. Sarah is a member of the Committee on the Environment, Public Health and Food Safety, as well as the Subcommittee on Public Health. Thank you for joining us, Sarah. We have Francesca Colombo, Head of the Health Division at the OECD.
Thank you.
Hi, Francesca.
Hi.
We have Ken Duckworth, a Chief Medical Officer of America's National Alliance on Mental Illness, or NAMI. Welcome, Ken.
Thank you.
And joining us very soon, we'll have Natasha Azzopardi-Muscat, who is Director of Health Policies and Systems at the World Health Organization's Europe office. There you are. Hi, Natasha. Good timing. And joining us later in this discussion, we'll also have one other member. We'll have Claudia Marinetti, who is Director of Mental Health Europe. Francesca, I wanted to come to you first. Can you set the scene for us? I mean, we've heard some figures there previously from our sponsor, but can you set the scene for us with regards to the scale of the mental health conditions across the OECD crisis? We know things got bad in the pandemic, but have they started to improve at all?
A little bit, so they've started to improve, but not as much as we would want. Look, we have heard already some of the key figure, but just to remind, in any given time, we have about 1 in 5 persons that are living with a mental health condition. So if you look around you, you find that you are 5 sitting, and it means that probably 1 among those 5 will be living with a mental health conditions of some sorts. And even throughout the life course, our work has shown that 1 in 2 people will experience a mental health conditions at some point during their lifetime. So we're talking about really a quite high prevalence and high numbers. Now, during COVID-19, mental health issues have really been exacerbating, particularly during moments of lockdown. We've really seen an increase, according also to prevalence surveys that have been carried out, an increase in mental health issues during the most difficult time, and then a sort of a relaxation or improvement during a time in which people could go back to a more seemingly normal life. So there's been a little bit that yo-yo, but so with particularly high shares of individuals experience things like symptoms of having depression, reaching to up to 1 in 3 people, depending on the countries considering. And if you look at the prevalence of depression before COVID, that was around a bit less than 10%, it went up to more than 20%. So it's really talking about quite a high number. Now, there have been some population groups particularly affected, and one that I would like to mention is the young people. They used to have a prevalence of mental health conditions a little bit below the average for the populations, but that through COVID, they actually experience mental health issues above what happened into the average individual in the populations. And this has remained still the case. So when we look right now at the prevalence of mental health conditions, things have improved from the peak of the pandemic, but we find still that on average about 20% higher rates relative to before. So it's not an absolute number here. So we're still not recovering completely. There are issues that we find, particularly in some population groups, as I mentioned, the youth, those who are more disadvantaged, or those who are unemployed, for example, or on low income, that are particularly more affected.
Thank you, Francesca. And there's some really quite drastic figures in there. I mean, 20% of people at any one point have depression, which seems a very high figure. Natasha, I wanted to ask your thoughts. You've been working for many years at the World Health Organization, where they monitor mental health conditions and provide guidance on how best to care for people with certain conditions. Do we know why things haven't improved despite the end of the global pandemic and a return to relative normality?
Thank you. So the expectation, I think, in general for people was that after the pandemic, everybody would bounce back. This is the classic definition of resilience, that you bounce back. But this has not happened. We are actually living in a very different era, and we need to see what is happening around us and make the best of it and see how to take things forward, because there's not going to be a bouncing back to how it was before. And I'd like to follow up perhaps on a couple of points also that Francesca was making so well. We are worried. We are worried in WHO Europe, particularly because of the mental health of young people and adolescents. We have our health behavior in school children survey, a survey, cross-sectional survey that takes place across countries of our region, and that has been taking place for a number of years now. And the latest survey data show that basically we really have a problem with mental health in young people and adolescents, such that, for example, when it comes to young girls, 1 in 4 of 15-year-old girls is really experiencing mental health problems, and more than a quarter of 15-year-old girls also report problems, for example, with loneliness, with sleep. Of course, even when we look at these averages, they mask the differences, and we know that the people who are suffering the most are those who are coming from backgrounds where there are social problems, unemployment, etc. This, of course, is a legacy issue now. It's not going to go away. And we are working, for example, closely also with the central banks in a new initiative, which we call Finding Common Ground, because everybody is becoming concerned about what is this going to mean for future education, for the future labor force that we will have in the European region. Clearly, also, we just do not have the health workforce, the mental health workforce that we need to cope with this huge burgeoning demand. In fact, the mental health workforce has actually decreased over the past 5 years, in spite of an increase in absolute numbers when we talk about the health and care workforce in the region. When we look specifically at the mental health workforce, this has decreased. So as you can see, the gap is growing bigger, and we need to find different ways to tackle the issue of mental health. And the one lesson that we have learned definitely in WHO is that we cannot tackle this as a health sector alone. Mental health has to become everybody's business.
Thank you, Natasha. You've touched on some really important points there. And one of the things you mentioned, obviously, is the real need to really focus on the deficit in the workforce to help care for these people. I see that looking at the June mental health common approach from the European Commission, that the WHO is working to deliver one of the key flagship initiatives in that report, which is on capacity building to promote mental health in all policies. And I wondered if you could give us an update on this and whether the project has started and what that work looks like.
So actually, we are, yes, delighted to be partnering with the EU, with the European Commission, working on this important area of mental health. As WHO, we are, of course, delighted that the European Union has placed such an emphasis on mental health. And also, we positively note the recent adoption of the Council conclusions. We are delivering various stages of this project. We actually worked with the European Commission to commission a survey. So the survey that was developed and sent to all member states was a joint initiative. And we will continue supporting both the joint action, the implemental joint action, where we have been working, for example, to develop suicide prevention plans, but also working on building capacity within countries with people and communities. And over here, of course, as WHO, we have a number of country offices in the eastern part of our region, most notably, but also in some countries of the European Union, which we shall partner with. But of course, we can also work with other countries because we need to take this to the national level. What is helping us also is the fact that we have set up what we call the Pan-European Mental Health Coalition, where we have representatives from all member states. And these are representatives from policy, from ministries of health, but also representatives from academia and from NGOs that have their umbrella organizations at European level, but again, that will have the grassroots organizations present in all countries. What we are trying to bring is this hallmark that this is not WHO that is developing this alone, but that we are co-creating it with stakeholders. And I'm particularly proud of the work we have just finished with young mental health advocates who work with us on the European Mental Health Coalition, where we have developed a toolkit with young mental health advocates that describes how to work and how to involve and how they can actually contribute to the development of policy capacity building, such that we move away from tokenism to the actual real and meaningful involvement. Because coming back to the fact that we don't have sufficient mental health workers, we have to work also with other stakeholders, with patients and persons with lived experience, and with other groups in communities. And the definition of community today, of course, is not just a geographic community, but particularly when we talk about young people, more and more, we are talking about digital and online communities.
Thank you, Natasha. You've raised some great points there. We'll come back to those that need to really work with the communities. And Ken, I'll bring you in shortly. But first, I wanted to go to Sarah, who's our politician on the panel. Sarah, one of the things I didn't mention in my introduction about you was the European Parliament's own initiative report on mental health, for which you are the rapporteur. And I wondered if you could give us some insight from your research on that project, and what can countries do to help prevent people from developing a mental health condition? And did you discover any best practices, for example, in prevention during your work on that report?
Hello, good afternoon, and thank you, Helen, for the question, and to be able to speak about the importance of mental health and mental health well-being above all. And I think it is important to stress. I'm not going to repeat the numbers that were already brought here to the discussion, but it's very important to underline that we are currently seeing an increase in mental health conditions that is quite worrying, because we find ourselves in a permanent crisis. We have the COVID-19 pandemic and the consequences of it. We have the wars that are ongoing at our borders. We have economic instability, the housing problem, the climate emergency, and this is all risk factors that can aggravate ongoing mental health conditions. And this is particularly of importance for youth. Their mental health has been disproportionately affected by these elements. So we have that the youth took it upon themselves to advocate for better mental health, and in a conference of the future of Europe, they had a proposal for further investment in mental health, and that was put forward. So we took it upon ourselves here in the Parliament, and seeing the communication by the Commission, which we highlight and appreciate to go even further and draw the first report on mental health by the European Parliament. So our first position, and what needs to be done. The priorities here in regards to prevention is to understand that through the life course approach, you can be susceptible at any time to develop a mental health condition. And if you are part of a vulnerable group, you can have a double, triple burden of suffering of these mental health conditions. And here we explore the importance of intersectionality and the importance of a life course approach to mental health, and having mental health in all policies, as it was already repeated by you. We also found out it's of the utmost importance to reduce mental health stigma. And this can create a double jeopardy to develop mental health conditions. Another important part is the shift towards biopsychosocial model of care. So here to explore intersectionality, collaboration between different health sectors, such as education, schools, where we can act before or in a very, very early stage. And this investment in community mental health care is very much important, and the importance of a multidisciplinary setting, as Natasha was just speaking about. Another matter which is very important on reintegration, I know this is tertiary prevention perhaps, is to promote deinstitutionalization and to have a person-centered approach. So we in this report we identify many of things that we can act upon at EU level, how to best support member states to address these issues. But there's 3 recommendations that I would like to highlight that we need more that the EU can do, which is we need a strategy for mental health in the EU. And it's quite interesting that Council just last week reflected that in their conclusions. We need a European Year of Mental Health. And we also need more financing. And for that, we ask for a specific mission on mental health on the horizon to Europe, so we can further achieve a true European Health Union that also includes action on mental health.
Thank you, Sarah. I heard those 3 points loud and clear. And I just wanted to ask you, we've obviously got European elections next year. How can we keep up the momentum, the political interest that we have seen more recently in improving mental health when there are so many other competing economic and social challenges?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And I think the answer lies within even your question, which is mental health needs to be seen as an economic and social outcome. Because if you have healthy people, you have a healthy economy. And when you invest in prevention, when you invest in tackling early diagnosis, in accessibility to care and proper care, you are actually having a high return when it comes to cost-efficient measures. And I think this is where we need to place our button on, which is the cost efficiency of acting and acting as EU in these issues that will have important outcomes and turn back for the GDP, not only of the EU, but of the different member states. So we should see that health is not only the health of the individuals, but when we talk about health, we're talking also about having healthier societies to live in, and that will undoubtedly bring economic and social outcomes, positive ones.
Thanks, Sarah. I wanted to go to Ken next. You're joining us from the United States. It feels like we're experiencing a real shift in countries' attitudes towards mental health care, or at least in Europe it feels that way. Can the same be said in the US? Is this a global trend towards improving mental health care, for example?
Yes and no. Attitudes are improving. There's more openness. NAMI has a program called Ending the Silence, which is people with mental health conditions going to middle schools and high schools. It's our fastest growing program. So to me, that says attitudes are changing. There's much more openness. It's a completely different time than it was a decade ago in that regard. Yet to understand American mental health care is to really look at the fragmentation of how funding streams are done. We've had a few successes on the federal level. This is 988, which is the 3-digit number for thoughtful, culturally informed crisis care for suicide prevention, and an early psychosis model funded by the federal government. But to understand America, you have to understand this is a country that was generated on suspicion of federal power. And so the states have a lot of authority. So I live in Massachusetts, which is about as close as you can get to my European friends on this call. Everybody in Massachusetts has insurance, but 30 million Americans do not. And there are states, Wisconsin and Texas, as good examples that have refused free federal money because of their ambivalence and concern about federal control. So it just illustrates that America is a more complicated space. Because we run more on a private insurance model, I'm happy to say businesses have shown much more interest in mental health. And so depression, of course, is the leading cause of workplace absenteeism and presenteeism. Presenteeism is defined by showing up but not working, not being effective. Businesses are waking up to that. So they're improving their benefits. They're trying to improve their culture. So unfortunately, in America, it won't come top down. It won't come only from the federal government. It'll come from a more complicated, fragmented funding streams. The role of businesses is important. And I should also mention the unique American problem with overdose deaths, which is in part because pain was interpreted as the fifth vital sign. And there was a lot of unscrupulous people in the opiate industry, and of course, problems with fentanyl. The Supreme Court today in the United States is reviewing what compensation should happen to the states and families who lost family members. America had over 100,000 opiate deaths last year, partly fentanyl, partly other things. But it's an extraordinary problem. And of course, the people that are at most risk for opiate deaths, the working poor, are the people most likely not to have insurance. I guess the twist to that would be Narcan has now been allowed to exist in pharmacies in America. Again, a rather private approach as opposed to making it a universal good. And finally, I should shout out the role of peers. Several of my colleagues have mentioned the adequacy of mental health professionals. That's true. That's true in America. But peers are a powerful force for good. They don't replace professionals. And I'm seeing a lot of developments in America where peer recovery specialists are getting increased support, training, and payment structures. So the idea is there's a whole group of people who've lived with things like bipolar disorder, with schizophrenia, with severe depression. They then become part of the professional workforce. They don't do diagnosis or treatment, but they do help to supplement that. So I think that's an interesting cultural development in the States. So I covered a lot of points: fragmentation, uninsured, opiates, changing attitudes in business, some successes on the federal level, 988 and the early psychosis model, which we borrowed straight from Australia, the University of Melbourne in particular. Mm-hmm. But mostly it's a state-by-state, employment-by-employment construct. So I'm sorry to say it's less coherent than my colleagues across the pond, but this gives NAMI a lot of work to do to advocate to change things.
Thank you, Ken. And I'm really interested how you said it was not a top-down, the benefits aren't top-down, they're coming through the sort of more business and corporate angles, because in Europe there have been real calls for a mental health strategy, which hasn't arrived. We had a mental health common approach, which the European Commission delivered last June. And whereas the United States has got a 3-year strategy announced earlier this year. And I just wondered to what extent that strategy is filtering down to clinicians like yourself. I mean, are you even aware of it, or is it making a difference?
The average clinician is overwhelmed with work. And the biggest dilemma they face is, should I take any insurance or not? Because the payments are inadequate. A 3-year master plan isn't really possible to be effectuated because so much of our benefits and developments are state-based. So I'm delighted the president mentioned mental health in his State of the Union address. I'm delighted he's working on new levels of parity. But as you know, America has a fairly divided government, and it's been very difficult for us to push things further at the federal level. But the key takeaway is that America was born on a suspicion of federal power. And I'm not happy about that, but that's the way it is. So each state, NAMI has representatives across each state, and we advocate for better services, better payment in line with a larger 3-year vision. But a lot of the struggles are the same. People who have mental health conditions are more frequently ending up in correctional settings than in hospitals. That's a crisis that's happening state by state and is best worked on at the local level, teaching judges and police officers how to think differently about these problems.
I'm seeing a lot of nodding heads among our other panelists. Francesca, I wanted to get your reaction there to something Ken said, and I wondered if there's some lessons that can be learnt in Europe with regards to, we have this real deficit in the labour market to deal with this surge in mental health care needs, but there's a real powerful force for good among peer support and the work that NAMI's doing. Do we have those kinds of examples in Europe, and could this be a model to really deal with this deficit in the labour market?
Look, I think pointing to the labour market is pointing to one of the weak spots. I mean, we talk a lot, and it was mentioned by the previous speakers, about the importance of an integrated approach that goes beyond the health sector and what the health professionals can do. Because truly, when you talk about mental health, the causes and the issues, the policies that you need to put in place needs to cut across the boundaries of different sectors, needs to look at employment, education, the social sectors, social protection, and so forth. Now, if we look at what is happening, we do have something called an OECD Council recommendations, a recommendation of the OECD Council on integrated mental health and work. This was agreed by countries in 2015, and there is a monitoring them process which is done to see the progress the countries have been making. And there have been some progress, particularly when we look at the integration with education sectors. So, looking and introducing things like social emotional skills in schools is done in some countries, having more, workers that work directly with children. That has been done. So there is more examples of integration. Much less has been done in terms of integrations with unemployment systems, with employment services more broadly, and also with welfare systems across countries. So it's an area in which it's difficult to point to some, particular good practice, because it's an area in which all countries, whether in Europe or outside Europe, in the OECD, are not doing as well. There are some ongoing and recent initiatives that has been put in place, some of the Nordic countries, as well as New Zealand. So, there is some movement which is happening, but would point out as the integration with employment and employment services, the labor market and welfare system as an area definitely for focus.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I'd like to bring in another speaker to our discussion today, what we call a fishbowl speaker. I'd like to bring in Claudia Marinetti, who is Director of Mental Health Europe. Claudia, for a long time, Mental Health Europe has been calling for Europe to have a more concrete mental health strategy, as we've heard before, with clear timelines, objectives, budget, indicators. But the European Commission's proposal didn't go that far. However, the European Council last week did set out that it asked the Commission to go further with budgeted and timed objectives. I just wondered what your view was on this and whether or not we're inching closer towards a strategy. Is this a better outcome as far as Mental Health Europe is concerned?
I think that, we were pleased, of course, to see that in the Council conclusions, again, because it happened already before these Council conclusions, there was a request for a strategy or an action plan. Let's even call it an action plan. I think that what the Commission came up with was a good starting point. Let's also consider that there was not that much time to develop this. It was a reaction to what the Conference on the Future of Europe has asked. So the Commission listened to the voice of people. But we keep insisting, and we are pleased that also, of course, that the Council of the European Union and the Parliament are with us on that we do need an action plan. Why do we need an action plan? Because for the time being, what we have is an approach, but it is a menu. And if we leave it just as it is, we fear that there will not be the right change in mental health, and also that there will be a deepening of inequalities when it comes to going ahead and improving prevention, improving promotion, and then improving also supports for people with mental health problems within and between countries in the European Union. So that is why we think it's very important. Then, of course, next year it's going to be a big year of change, new Parliament, new Commission, and there is, of course, the fear that that then the topic we might lose the momentum. So that in this sense, it's quite important that we had these conclusions, and we keep saying that. And also, of course, I agree with Sarah that a year of mental health would also be a signal, an important signal. But we think there is a necessity definitely for an action plan, and benchmarks with a budget as well, like really a dedicated budget, rather than bringing in all the different streams that are already there.
And it sounds like there's a real urgency to have it completed within that window before the next European Parliament or the elections start for the next European Parliament. Do you think that could be possible?
No, I don't. I think that it takes quite some time to have a proper action plan. And we are in December. No, I don't expect that. But that is why it's very important that with the new Parliament and the new Commission, we remind them of what the Council conclusions were and of what people in Europe are asking for.
And what we do have alignment between the Council and the Commission is this real need to be for mental health care to be considered across all policies, cross-sectorial. But as we know, Europe's leaders have many competing interests at the moment: global, societal, economic, political demands, migration, the cost of living, supporting ongoing war efforts in Ukraine. I just wondered what Mental Health Europe's approach is to really try to get the ear of leaders and really persuade them of the importance of investing in promotion, prevention and treatment of mental health across all policies.
I think, and this is also a bit reflected on what I heard today, but also in discussions that we are having also as Mental Health Europe with other stakeholders, I think that there is this try to make a change, to have a paradigm shift. But I think we really need to disrupt the way in which we see mental health. So, we talk, for instance, I heard a lot today about disorders, about treatment. Basically, what we would like to do is actually to move away from a biomedical model towards a psychosocial model. And here also WHO, with their publication on guidance and practice for mental health, human rights and legislation, and also OECD with their Wise Center report, they recognize the biomedical model is basically obsolete. What is wrong with it? It sees people as individuals that are dysfunctional, so clearly the disorder, that need to be fixed, that are unable to know what is better for them, who are mainly unwell because of biological issues, who cannot really contribute to society. And here then we still talk then about treatment. We should talk about recovery, and the path to recovery should be co-created. We talk about reintegrating people after recovery. People should never have been isolated to begin with. It's really, I think that us as a society, we need to change the way in which we see mental health. We say, and it's right, that at any time, people in their lifetime could develop a mental health condition. But we seem sometimes to forget that mental health is also a continuum between good mental health and eventually psychosocial disability. And this is very important to keep in mind also when you look into the sustainability of mental health systems, because we heard talking about peer workers. Sometimes that is what a person needs. Sometimes you don't necessarily need more than that. Let's talk about early intervention. So if we don't change the way in which you are thinking about mental health, it's going to be very, very difficult for us to change and to move away from traditional ways in which we can support mental health, in which we can provide support and services, in which we can promote mental health and prevent mental health. And this is also, we really see it across a lot of issues. I can give you like a few examples. For instance, in terms of research, there is still so much money that goes into brain research or into behavioral therapies research. Let's look into, when we talk about mental health, research into the social determinants, research into bringing co-creation, research into community support. And this often, when you think about innovation, you always think about digitalization and medicines. But let's talk about social innovation as well, if you want to make a change in mental health.
I want to bring in a question which touches on something you touched on just now from one of our watchers, from Brian Carhill, who's a researcher at Mental Health Cost Action. He asks, how can we reduce precarious careers for young people? Precarity incentivizes overworking and related occupational burnout and work-life imbalance. So how can we reduce this among young people? Claudia.
Okay, so we're moving completely away now from the services. I guess that there are various policies that can be done. Let's also look into the fact that at the moment we are at one of the lowest, I think, percentage of unemployment in Europe. So let's invest that and let's see why this is happening. In terms of the precarity, it is also about, of course, about systems at national level. So again, with member states having different types of protection for employment, it is then you would need to go and dig into what kind of incentives it can be done to an employer to keep people instead of, for instance, giving short contracts. What kinds of incentives are there to provide, for instance, paid internships? Because this is also an issue that young people sometimes find themselves going from one unpaid internship to another, and not everybody also can afford that, and not everybody has a family that can afford that. Then, of course, then we could even go into the issue of the digital platform kind of work and how you can legislate on that. So I think it's quite a broad questions with a lot of answers. But this is definitely a link also to mental health. And when I was going back to talk about disorders, can you talk about a disorder if you have you experience anxiety, if you experience depression because you are in precarious work? Is there something wrong with you? My personal answer would be no.
Thank you. And I know that, Natasha, you'd like to come in on that question as well. How can we reduce precarious careers for young people?
So I'd like to take this a bit more broadly, because basically, as we are all saying, we can't just continue to take a curative approach and treat this wave of anxiety and depression that is affecting so many people purely from the biomedical or psychiatric point of view, which is what Claudia was saying when she was talking about social innovation. And therefore, we need to really look upstream at what is triggering all this anxiety, depression, etc. And earlier this year, in March, we held a forum where we very much looked at the links between health and the well-being economy. A number of countries in the European region and beyond are trying to push the concept of looking beyond economic growth and GDP and looking towards inclusive growth and the pursuit of economies that really work for people. What do we mean? It means that it works from a human, from a social, from an economic, and from a planetary perspective. And we believe that these are the kind of links that we need to be looking at. We need to be looking at where people live, how they work, and how this is having an impact positively or negatively, more likely, on people's well-being. And this is an area which is WHO Euro. We are actively partnering and investigating, because far too often what we are seeing is that health systems are really picking up the pieces of economic and societal failures. And as Ken said, when the health system cannot cope, then it ends up becoming the justice and forensic system that starts to unfortunately pick up those people and the pieces of those lives that we have lost, that we have failed to protect. And therefore, also because we will never have all the money and all the health workers we need to cope with all the healthcare need and demand which we are facing, we must definitely focus on trying to create communities and societies that really promote the health and well-being of people. And for example, not to underestimate also the impact of the changed climate on people's mental health. Increasingly, we are seeing that a number of young people are becoming increasingly anxious because of the climate emergencies and climate change that we are seeing. So just to say that this is all interlinked. We cannot separate physical and mental health, but we cannot separate mental health from the wider issues affecting our economies and societies.
Thank you, Natasha. And Francesca, I just wanted to get your view linked to that. I mean, EU countries are facing huge economic and strains currently with so many demands. And I don't think anyone's really expecting EU health funding in the next mandate to be at the same levels as it is today. So where should countries really prioritise their efforts if they're going to really try to make a difference? And for want of a better phrase, are there any low-hanging fruit in terms of making a big difference in the coming months and years for mental health conditions in Europe?
Well, certainly, I mean, one area is to strengthen even much more the prevention. We know that the returns on investments from preventions are very high. We know that working on things even like social connectiveness, working with individuals to have a a positive mental health as an outcome in general of societal action, to make sure that there is really early on interventions and even low thresholds intervention that really act upon at the very beginning when there is an issue, and even raising mental health literacy, these sorts of things. That's a very important area, because that's where the costs are low, but the returns are high. The cost in terms of the interventions that are low. So that would be one area. The second one, I think, again, it goes back to the issues of the integrated mental health approach. If we look at unemployment services, most of the people with low mental health issues can be found in unemployment services, because there are people that are facing with multiple things. They're unemployed, they're depressed, they have issues. And I think it's working through having mental health services and approaches integrated within those more societal services that we have, whether it's their welfare system, unemployment services, and so forth. I think that's really quite important, because the costs for societies in terms of having individuals being either in work but being less productive at work, or being outside of the labor market, are particularly high. And so the returns of investments here become really quite high. So those are some of the, if you want, low-hanging fruits, where I think it would be really quite important to make significant improvements.
Thank you. And I'm just going to pull in one last question from one of our observers before we wrap up, from iMosca, and I'm going to address this to you, Sarah. They're asking how to strategically allocate funding to mental health, and are there any exemplary country models that demonstrate effective approaches to mental health funding and support?
Need to unmute myself first before replying. But yes, we have different examples of how to better allocate funds in order to have the best outcomes possible when it comes to health. But here I would like to state that we cannot just look into mental health as of the conditions, but we also need to work on how we can make a society, healthier society, also from a mental health point of view. We discuss so much about having healthy people in the physical sense of view, but we must not push back the mental health perspective on this, and the systematic response is needed in order to achieve this, and also targeting the determinants of health. And this goes in line with the previous question on the work conditions and the work-life balance and the precarious conditions of the youth, and that links with the perma crisis that we are experiencing, and that hits more specifically young people. For that, there's many things that we are doing now at Parliament. From the point of view of my political group, we have been streamlining paid internships for all, and guaranteeing that those that initiate their adult life have the conditions to do so without putting themselves at burden of the different stressors that there are for mental health. In regards to how to better allocate resources, it's important to have these best practices shared, and there's a really interesting portal launched by the Commission on best practices and initiatives that is ongoing, and there was a call for that until September, October this year, and very much looking forward for the results of that and how they can be transferable to one place and another. Because when we talk about mental health, and specifically mental health in the EU, we cannot talk about one approach fits all, and we need to ensure that we take into consideration the specificities of the different communities we are talking about. So an intervention that we do in Funchal, in Madeira, and outermost region, perhaps is not the most adequate to implement here in Brussels, and vice versa. So there's a lot of interchange that also needs to happen in order to have better outcomes. And just finalizing in my response, for us to have better outcomes, we also need better research into the different mental health interventions that are there, and the cost analysis of these interventions, so we know what are the most efficient practices. Because when it comes to health, we have a tendency to looking into just the disease, but if we look at how much we are saving, we're going to end up with a much more cost-effective interventions than if we only look at the treatment part or reintegration part. So we need to have comprehensive approach through the different spectrum of primordial, primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention.
Thank you, Sarah. And I just want to throw in one more question, which I will put to Claudia and then Ken, if I can. And it's really, I mean, I know we've talked about moving away from a biomedical model and towards a psychosocial model in dealing with mental health care. But for the more extreme end of the mental health disorders, such as post-traumatic stress disorder, there is a lot of interest in psychedelics or assisted psychedelic treatment. And last week, actually, one MP from Ukraine called for his country to be a testbed for these therapies, as they have such soaring rates of PTSD. And I just wondered, first, Claudia, if you could give me your response to psychedelics just generally. Is this a bit of hype, do you think, or could they make a real difference among these patient groups?
First, I don't know. I am not specialized in this, but I have two warnings around this. So probably what happens is that it works for some people, and then very good, as long as you are sure that you have the right clinical trials. And then, I know that there is some issues. Some people are raising issues with the methodology in terms of how blind actually, when you do a clinical trials, the groups are. But let's not go for that. My issue with this is that they could work for some and they could go work for not, like many other supports. My fear is that I have the feeling that this is a bit the new SSRI, the new antidepressant, in which everybody thinks this is the pill that is going to fix people. And I fear, while it should be just one of the various types of supports that are available to people, and people should always know what are their choices when they need to choose a support for their mental health. And that's how it should remain. And my fear at the moment is that some people, I'm not necessarily the researcher that are working on this, but they are taking this, that's it. This is what's going to fix people. Mm-hmm. And then we go away from the need to disrupt and to change how we understand mental health. It will take away the focus on the social determinants, etc. So yes, it could be something that is good for some people. Is this going to fix the mental health crisis? I would be surprised.
And Ken, I just wanted to get your response to the movement.
It won't surprise you as a psychiatrist that I'm not ready to give up on the biopsychosocial model, because if you look at so many actual mental health conditions, that's the best way to approach them. Like prevention, like promoting community, psychedelics would be an example that our treatments are inadequate. People have side effects from many of the medications. Most people can't access psychotherapy. Why NAMI is interested in promoting this research and why the FDA in America has fast-tracked it is PTSD has become, a very difficult experience for many people and co-occurs with depression, with suicidal risk, with addiction. And so it's an important public health problem. So the idea of what's being looked at the FDA through this fast track is guided psychotherapy. So the key with psychedelics is don't try this at home. And we need to research these questions. The Health and Human Services just this weekend said that marijuana should be researched. What we did in America is we legalized it without researching it. I think you need to make these things studyable so that we can learn who it might help and who it might harm. So the same is true with psychedelics. But I do want to say, developing new treatments is not at odds with promoting community connection. It's not at odds with thinking about the social determinants of health. There are many gears in the mental health system, and I would say in America, they're all inadequate. So I welcome anybody who's trying to work on drug discovery, new psychotherapies, ways to foster connection. bringing peers into the workforce, to me, every gear is inadequate. And so I welcome efforts in every space in the mental health and mental illness field.
Thank you, Ken. And I think you've done an excellent job there of almost summing up for me. That is all we've got time for today. I'd like to say a big thank you to our speakers for joining us for that fascinating, I think, discussion on mental health. And I think it's clear that Europe and across the world has a big challenge on its hands tackling some of these high rates of mental health conditions. But this year in Europe alone, it does feel like there has been a bit of a shift and more political attention from the European Commission, Council and Parliament, all publishing, or at least hopefully soon, a series of documents to really swing the balance towards mental health care across Europe on an equal footing towards physical health care. The big question now remains as to how Europe and the member states will take these initiatives, and whether governments will really stump up the support and the investment if needed to really implement them. And I think we've heard a really interesting discussion there around the need for many areas of investment. And I thought the peer support argument was very strong with regards to supporting the labour markets. And there's also a real need to work among the younger generations, especially in schools, and capacity building in those areas to make sure children do not fall into the mental health statistics that we've heard earlier. Before we go, we'll take a quick look at the results of the poll that was presented by our partner Boehringer Ingelheim. The question was, how aware are you of your country's political strategy or goals to improve mental health care? And the results are pretty strong. So the majority, 42%, say they are somewhat aware, and then 26% are not very aware, 18% not aware at all, and just 14% are actually fully aware. So I think that tells us something that countries need to do a bit more to really publicise if they have a mental health strategy and what that entails. Finally, a thank you to our audience for tuning in online, to our speakers again for joining us for that discussion, and to our partner Boehringer Ingelheim for making this event possible. We'd love to hear your feedback, so feel free to get in touch. You can email us at live@politico.eu, and you can check out what other events we've got going on in the coming months. There's a full lineup on our website, www.politico.eu/events. Thank you and goodbye.
This is an age of disruption, of profound revolutionary change.
What we're really asking ministers is to empower the ambassadors.
The only thing that you really push forth is the truth.
You don't see many women represented when it comes to the decisions as to how to handle the pandemic.